Next up will be Grace Baines from Springer Nature. I believe we'll be giving an extemporaneous presentation.
Thanks, Todd. Hi, everyone. So, in the data sessions I've been in this week, we've talked a lot about FAIR, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And our experience this morning with my slides is exactly about lack of interoperability, in that we could not get them off my laptop and onto this computer. So unfortunately, that means that they are not reusable, and they're findable to me and accessible to me, but not to you. So I'm going to look at my slides and talk you through them. You're probably grateful for a break from PowerPoint anyway at this point at the conference. I will try and make them available somehow or afterwards, because I had all sorts of references and things I wanted to show you. So I'm going to talk from a publisher's perspective about our experience of both implementing data policies and then a little bit about what we do in terms of reviewing data, so quality assuring, quality checking data, and then talk about peer review of data using one specific journal, which is a data journal as an example. So the first thing I wanted to say is actually ties in very nicely with what Elizabeth was saying, which is that before we even get into talking about how we make this work, we need to think about who we're asking to share their data, and that's authors. And we recently did a piece of market research where we asked over 7,000 researchers how easy they find it to share their data and what's holding them back. We published that as a white paper. It's freely available on Figshare. I also, if you were in the session yesterday morning, I also talked about it there. Overwhelmingly, authors told us that organizing and presenting their data in a useful way is one of the things they find most challenging. They also have questions about which repository to use. They're not sure if they're allowed to share their data. Do they have the rights to share their data? How do they license their data? So that's all context for the fact that we're about to ask authors and researchers to do a whole load of new things, which I believe they should do as a responsible part of doing their research, but they need help to do so. And lots of advice and support. And we as publishers haven't necessarily helped authors with that over time. Journal data policies have been inconsistent, absent, or not clear. So there's a real need for clarity and also for simplicity for researchers in what journals are asking and in instructing researchers to do in sharing data. So what the team at Springer Nature did was, in 2016, introduced a standardized framework of journal data policies. So we published just over 2,000 journals. We have a standard framework of 4 policy types, and every one of our journals that adopts a data policy will use one of those policy types. So in theory, it should be much simpler for authors. And those 4 policy types range from a very gentle encouragement, which is what we call a type 1 policy. So data sharing and data citation are encouraged, but they're not mandated. Moving to data sharing and evidence of that data sharing, which is a data accessibility statement in the manuscript, are encouraged. And then we get into the more stringent requirements. So type 3, data sharing is encouraged, and the statement about the data availability is required. And then requiring data sharing and evidence of that sharing is required by, I think it's 7 or 8 journals, including our data journals. Through this work, in coming up with these standardized data policies, and since, in the year or so since we've released them, many other publishers have also released standardized journal data policies, which is wonderful. Elsevier, Taylor and Francis, and others. What we realized is that as a community we should work together, because it's all very well for Springer Nature to have a set of standardized data policies, but then if I'm a researcher or an author and I go and I publish one manuscript with a Springer Nature journal, and then 6 months later, I publish with a Elsevier or Wiley journal, I have to come to understand their data policies, how they're different. So what we've been doing under the auspices of the Research Data Alliance is one of my colleagues, Ian, who is our head of data publishing, has been co-chairing with a number of others a working group which is seeking to, across publishers and now funders, agree a common framework for research data policies. So that means that any journal, any publisher could then adopt the most appropriate data policy for their journal or for their journals from that framework without having to do all of the work of figuring out what a good data policy looks like. That group is making very good progress. The master framework has been published in a draft format for comments, and I'm hopeful that they will finalise their work towards the end of this year. If you're interested in getting involved in that, I had a link for you, but I can provide details. Something else that we do is that we recommend repositories to researchers. So on journals like Scientific Data, which is a data journal, we require the data to be available in the most suitable repository. We don't accept any other method of sharing other than deposit in a repository for that journal in particular. The only exception to that is, for example, sensitive or patient data, where we will work with the researcher to find the most appropriate place for them to store that data and make it accessible to people who should have access to it. But finding the right repository can be a challenge for researchers, we know that. So we have a publicly accessible list of more than 80 repositories which we recommend to researchers. All of those repositories we have worked with and we have analysed against a set of criteria to ensure that they comply with the standards for journals like Scientific Data. So in terms of what makes a good repository, and I feel almost embarrassed speaking about this in front of two very, very experienced repository managers, we're looking for long-term persistence and preservation of data sets, be recognised by a research community or research institution, provide stable and persistent identifiers, allow access to the data without unnecessary restrictions, and providing clear licensing choices. So these are the types of things that we are looking at when we look at repositories, and then we're advising researchers to do. And in general, wherever there is a field-specific repository that's appropriate for that piece of research, we will recommend that repository. And where we can't do that, we will recommend a general repository such as Dryad or Figshare. This is quite a lot of information already, right? And if you're confused, imagine how confused researchers are. So one of the other things that we do is we, at the same time as we implemented our journal data policies, we set up a help desk, which is a free service. It's available to authors and also to our editors of our journals, because this is new for them as well. And it's run by members of the data publishing team who work with repositories, who really understand data management, understand data curation, and they will advise on journal policies, they will advise on which repository to use, and also, when asked, can also provide advice on funder policies. We're actually, interestingly, very infrequently asked about funder policies, but perhaps that's because researchers are getting that information from somewhere else. So I mentioned the 4 types of policies. Many of the nature journals and all of the BMC journals now require authors to include a data accessibility statement. So that's a statement that explains how the data that supports that article can be accessed and used. We encourage data citation. In general, as I've mentioned, we also encourage putting data into a repository, but on those data availability statements, we will allow supplementary information, like data included in supplementary information, and in some cases, data available on request. And we also do have templates available to authors to help them write those data availability statements. So I'm mentioning this because it was actually quite an interesting exercise in implementing this on journals and understanding what the implications were for, there's obviously implications for authors, but one of the things we looked at was implications for editors in terms of their time and effort. So we did it in 2 phases, and there is a preprint on bioRxiv, it's a paper in Press, which summarizes the findings of this piece of in-house research that we did. And we looked at the time that it took editors to both check for compliance with the data policy on that journal and to help authors write the appropriate data availability statement, or make sure the appropriate data availability statement was in their article. And we did that with 4 journals initially, 4 nature-branded journals, and then we rolled it out to a further 20 journals. What we found is that where a journal is encouraging data sharing, so where they're saying, please include a data availability statement and say where your data are, then the time to do that was somewhere around 3.5 minutes per paper for an editor to do that. Where we were requiring that there was a data availability statement included in the manuscripts, that went up to about 6 minutes a paper. And where we were actually checking that the data were archived, were made available in a suitable place, and links work, and all of those things, then that goes up to just over 12 minutes per manuscript, which is worthwhile, but also worth considering. And one thing that we've learned from working on a data journal over several years is this is not something you can ask peer reviewers to do and check for you. This is something that that the journal needs to be doing and taking care of. All of that said, on a journal like Scientific Data, we do actually peer review the data as well. Because Scientific Data is a journal, it's a data journal, it publishes articles that describe scientifically valuable data sets. It's not looking for novelty, it's not looking for impact, but it is looking for scientifically valuable data sets. We don't publish any findings, so there's no, when the researchers aren't they're reporting the methodology of gathering that data and describing the data set, but they're not reporting what they found from the research. That's often in an accompanying research article. So our acceptance criteria are based on the technical rigor of the procedures used to generate the data, the reuse value of the data, and the completeness of the description of the data. And we also, as I mentioned, require that the data must be available. We also don't allow restrictions on commercial reuse in that journal on that data set. So what do we ask the peer reviewers? Well, what we use those peer reviewers for, or ask them for, is their scientific expert advice on the data itself. So we're asking about the method in which the data were produced. Was it rigorous? Was it methodologically sound? Was the technical quality of the data supported convincingly with the experiments that were designed and the statistical analyses? Are the methods and any data processing steps described in sufficient detail to allow others to reproduce? And did the author provide all the information needed for others to reuse this data set or integrate it with other data? Then in addition to that, we have an in-house curation team who curate the metadata associated with that data. So we then do an in-depth curation of the metadata associated with that data set. So again, that's an investment of editorial resource to do that. Scientific Data is one journal. It's a very specialist journal, and that level of data checking and support is not going to be suitable or appropriate or manageable for every journal. But we know, as I mentioned at the beginning, that many researchers do want and need help in depositing and sharing their data. So earlier this year, we introduced a service we're calling Research Data Support, which helps researchers to deposit their data into, we're currently partnering with Figshare, but the idea is that we should be able to offer that into other repositories over time. write the data availability statements, write a human readable description, curate the metadata, and do things like checking the file opens, checking it has no viruses, doing a check that we can't see immediate signs of sensitive data that shouldn't be shared. So are there more than a certain number of identifiers that might identify an individual, for example? And then handing that back to the author, but also we can also publish it on Figshare on their behalf. And this absolutely is not intended to replace or compete with any service that is provided by an institution or a repository, but where that isn't available to researchers and to institutions, we hope that this is an additional service that will help. And the main thing is about making that data findable, accessible, and citable by making sure that it has really good metadata described and you can actually access it, which I'm sorry that I couldn't with my PowerPoint presentation, but thank you very much for your time, and I'll hand over to